There is an old railroader story about 3 SD-45 locomotives in a tunnel, all at run 8, full throttle. The crew member who wrote about it years later on a rail forum did not call it loud. He said there were no words, just the feeling in your chest cavity, the ringing that stayed for hours, and the absolute certainty that whatever just happened to your ears was not supposed to happen. EMD was not selling quiet. They were selling horsepower. They shipped a 20-cylinder locomotive with a turbo that a lot of crews later described as a scream, and let the crews figure out the rest. EMD built 1,260 SD-45 locomotives between 1965 and 1971. By the 1970s, a lot of railroads began rebuilding, repowering, or trading them away. People who were there do not describe it as noise. They describe pressure. The way the sound did not just hit your ears, but your ribs. The way conversations stopped without anyone deciding to stop talking. You did not cover your ears out of instinct. You froze because your body was busy processing something it was not built to handle. Even years later, that is the part they remember first. Not the train, but the feeling. The SD-45 was EMD's answer to a problem that occupied American railroads in the 60s. Trains were getting longer, heavier, and existing locomotives could barely keep up. The competition was not sitting still either. General Electric was rolling out higher power road units like the U-25B and the U-28B, and EMD felt the pressure. Their solution was brutally simple. Take the proven 645 diesel engine, add 4 cylinders to the standard 16, and you get 3,600 horsepower on one frame. On paper, this made sense, but in practice, it turned out to be a machine you felt before you heard it. The technology behind it is simple. A turbocharger runs on exhaust gases. More cylinders means more exhaust, and more exhaust can drive the turbo harder at full power. On many 16-cylinder EMDs, the turbo produces a whine. On the SD-45, many crews described it as a scream. Layer that on top of the deep bass of 20 cylinders firing together, and you get what one railroader later called the best sound of any locomotive, and absolutely brutal on your ears. There are quotes from crews who lived through this, scattered across internet forums where railroaders trade stories. One wrote years later, "Forget whine, forget howl. The correct description is scream. 3 SD-45s, one tight tunnel, all at run 8, equals a noise that words lack being able to describe." Another wrote about the physical impact. You feel it inside of you, reverberating in the chest cavity of your body. Hearing protection definitely required. And then there was the engineer who dryly noted that you really should not go into the engine room of an F-45 at full power. He absolutely did not recommend that. These weren't comments from people unfamiliar with diesel locomotives. These were people who worked around them for a living, who knew what loud meant, and who had experience with most major EMD and GE road engines. And they were saying this thing felt different. The SD-45 wasn't just another step up on the volume scale. Some crews said it felt extreme compared with other road diesels they had worked around. EMD's focus at the time was output and reliability, not comfort. The sound was a byproduct of that focus, not something that received much attention during development. The first production SD-45 for Great Northern arrived in 1966. Great Northern called it hustle muscle. The name tells you something about how the locomotive was perceived: raw, aggressive, and built for work. The flared radiators at the rear made it instantly recognizable. Burlington Northern, Southern Pacific, and Santa Fe bought hundreds. In total, 1,260 units were built between 1965 and 1971. For EMD, that was a commercial success. For sales departments, it meant strong order books. For the crews running them day after day, the experience was more complicated. The 20-cylinder engine soon developed serious reliability issues. Reports and railroad maintenance discussions often point to structural and support problems in the long engine block, along with bearing wear under sustained heavy loads. Some railroads reported units failing in service and needing shop attention. Locomotives were taken out of rotation and returned for repairs, disrupting schedules and frustrating operating departments. EMD introduced reinforcements and revisions over time, but the reputation stuck. In the railroad industry, word travels fast when engines develop recurring problems. What ultimately worked against the SD45 was economics. The extra 600 horsepower came with 4 additional cylinders worth of maintenance, increased fuel consumption, and more parts that could fail. At low speeds, traction often became the limiting factor, which meant the extra horsepower was not always usable. The rails and the physics imposed their own limits. At higher speeds, many railroads found that the SD40 family performed adequately, while being simpler and cheaper to operate. Why pay for the scream if it doesn't move more freight? The market answered quickly. The SD45-2 was introduced in 1972 and sold 136 units in total. The SD40-2, by comparison, sold over 4,000. That wasn't a close contest. It was a clear verdict. What happened to the existing fleet reflected that shift. Southern Pacific rebuilt large numbers of SD45 locomotives into SD45R units with 16-cylinder engines. Santa Fe carried out similar rebuilds. Wisconsin Central acquired many second-hand SD45 locomotives in the 1990s, ran them hard for years, and following the CN takeover, the fleet was eventually retired. Montana Rail Link was among the last operators to keep original 20-cylinder SD45 locomotives in service, with some units lasting into the early 2020s. And yet, that scream. Because even stripped of context, even decades later, the sound still does the same thing. It turns heads. It pulls people closer instead of pushing them away. You see it in the way crowds react when an SD45 opens up. Not applause, not cheering, but silence. People stop moving. They look at each other. They grin. Their bodies are reacting before their brains catch up. There are still places today where you can hear and feel an SD45 with a 20-cylinder engine. The Lake Superior Railroad Museum in Duluth maintains GN400, the original hustle muscle, in operational condition. The locomotive received a replacement 20-cylinder engine in 2019, allowing it to continue running. Whatever the business reasoning behind that decision, it kept the sound alive. The Illinois Railway Museum also operates SD45WC7525 for special events, giving modern audiences a chance to experience the locomotive under power. If people still talk about the SD45, it is not because of spreadsheets or specifications. It is because of the physical memory it left behind. You could ignore the numbers. You could forget the diagrams. But standing near multiple SD45s at full power was an experience that stayed with people. Some sounds do not fade quietly. The SD45 did not disappear overnight, and it was not a failure in the dramatic sense. It faded because the cost and complexity were not worth the extra horsepower. That is not tragedy. That is economics. Railroads do not buy machines because they sound impressive or look intimidating. They buy machines that make money. And by that measure, the screamer lost. But in Duluth, Great Northern 400 still runs and still screams. If you have never stood next to a 20-cylinder EMD at full throttle, now you know where to go. And if you have, you already know why people still talk about it. Most locomotives make noise. This one made trouble. When Union Pacific tested it in California, people reacted instantly. The noise cut through entire neighborhoods, and it didn't take long before communities decided they didn't want this machine anywhere near them. It didn't sound like a train at all. It sounded like a jet engine that refused to quiet down. The heat pouring out of the exhaust could soften asphalt on a warm day, and anything flying overhead was simply unlucky. Even the crews who ran it said you didn't just hear the turbine, you felt it in your chest long before it came into view. This was the locomotive too loud, too hot, and too overwhelming for the places people lived. And somehow, Union Pacific still put it to work every single day. In 1962, the city of Los Angeles delivered an unprecedented message to Union Pacific Railroad. Your locomotives were no longer welcome, not because they derailed, not because they were unsafe, but because the noise was so unbearable that communities simply would not tolerate it anymore. These were Union Pacific's gas turbine electric locomotives, machines that produced a deafening jet engine roar. The noise was so intense that they were effectively banned from operating in major California cities, including Los Angeles. Crews complained constantly. When Union Pacific later relocated the horns to prevent ice buildup, the change came with an ironic benefit. The crew finally got relief from the relentless sound. But the noise was only the beginning. The exhaust could melt pavement. The heat cooked birds in mid-flight. And the sheer power, 8,500 horsepower, carried hidden costs no one fully anticipated. That figure came from the turbine in the B unit. The whole 3-unit set functioned as one locomotive in service. After World War II, Union Pacific faced a dilemma. Their legendary big boy steam locomotives were nearing the end of their service lives, but the diesels of the era simply couldn't match their power. A typical diesel, like the EMDF-3, produced about 1,500 horsepower. A big boy produced around 7,000. To replace one big boy, you needed 4 or 5 diesels working together. That was expensive and complicated. Union Pacific wanted something better, something more powerful, something radical. General Electric had spent the war years advancing gas turbines for military aircraft, so General Electric proposed adapting that jet engine technology for the railroad. The advantages looked irresistible: enormous power, compact machinery, and the ability to burn Bunker C fuel, a thick, low-value byproduct oil that refineries were practically giving away. In 1948, General Electric delivered the prototype. Unit 50 produced 4,500 horsepower from a single engine, triple the output of the average diesel. Union Pacific was impressed enough to order production units. Between 1952 and 1961, 55 gas turbine locomotives entered service across 3 generations. The final series, 30 units numbered 1 through 30, were among the most powerful locomotives in the United States at the time. They were also about to become the loudest. Union Pacific called them Big Blows. The nickname was earned. Union Pacific said these locomotives produced a deafening jet engine exhaust noise. Inside the combustion chamber, fuel burned at 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Exhaust blasted from the roof at 150 miles per hour, with temperatures reaching 850 degrees Fahrenheit. It was not just loud, it was a continuous jet roar you could hear miles before the locomotive arrived. When Union Pacific tested the turbines between Salt Lake City and Los Angeles, communities reacted immediately. The tremendous noise made the locomotives deeply unpopular. After only a few trial runs in 1962, Los Angeles became effectively off-limits. Union Pacific restricted turbine operations around major cities. Crews suffered too. Engineers and firemen filed so many noise complaints that Union Pacific had to take action. In the mid-1960s, the railroad relocated the horns to prevent ice buildup in winter. The move had an unexpected side effect. The new location finally reduced the noise inside the cab. These locomotives could not operate where people actually lived. They were too loud for cities, too loud for suburbs, too loud for anywhere except the most remote stretches of railroad. For the crews, running a turbine wasn't just another assignment. It was unlike anything else in American railroading. Starting one felt closer to preparing an aircraft than a locomotive. Engineers would idle the small diesel, bring electrical systems online, and then light the turbine. When the jet engine ignited, the sound was immediate and overwhelming. The roar built steadily, rising into a relentless jet engine blast that never faded. Inside the cab, normal conversation was almost impossible. Even after the horns were moved, many engineers relied on hand signals or waited for throttle changes to speak. Veterans later described the experience as relentless. The roar never stopped, even after hours of operation. But the power was unforgettable. A single turbine could pull a train that usually required multiple diesels. Engineers described the feeling as unstoppable, right up until something went wrong. A flameout in a tunnel, a sudden loss of power, or a fuel flow issue could turn that confidence into fear. It was a machine that demanded respect. No one who ran one ever forgot it. And the noise was matched by extreme heat. The turbines earned another nickname, bird cookers. The column of superheated exhaust rising from these locomotives was so intense that birds flying overhead were literally consumed in mid-flight. It was not folklore, it was documented reality. Infrastructure suffered too. Near Ogden, Utah, yard crews developed special procedures for starting turbines under the Riverdale Road overpass. When the turbine fired up, exhaust at 850 degrees blasted upward at 150 miles per hour. The asphalt pavement above softened, melted, and sometimes ignited. Crews had to time starts carefully to avoid fire. Tunnels were worse. The turbines consumed oxygen so rapidly that in confined spaces they would flame out. Trains were left stranded while superheated exhaust filled the bore. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and expensive. The fuel itself was a nightmare. Bunker C had the consistency of molasses at room temperature. Before use, it had to be heated to 200 degrees, using massive heaters built into the 24,000-gallon tenders. The fuel was corrosive and full of ash and sulfur. That caused soot buildup, blade erosion, and constant overhauls. For several years, Union Pacific made it work. The turbines dominated the long, open eastern district between Council Bluffs and Ogden, territory where noise complaints were minimal. At their peak, these 55 locomotives hauled more than 10% of Union Pacific's total freight tonnage. But the economics were fragile. The turbines used roughly twice as much fuel as equally powerful diesel locomotives. This worked only because Bunker C was cheap waste oil. But by the mid-1960s, the plastics industry discovered uses for heavy petroleum byproducts. Refiners learned how to crack Bunker C into more valuable fuels. Prices skyrocketed. Union Pacific's fuel advantage evaporated almost overnight. High maintenance costs, noise restrictions, and tunnel problems all collided at once. The turbines became unsustainable. The first retirements began in 1968. On December 26, 1969, the last turbine made its final run from Cheyenne to North Platte. By February 1970, all remaining units were officially retired. Some had operated barely a decade. That was shockingly short for machines this expensive. Union Pacific preserved nothing. 20 were returned to General Electric and stripped for parts. 10 were sold to Continental Leasing and dismantled. The rest went straight to scrap. Only 2 survived. UP-18 is at the Illinois Railway Museum. UP-26 is at the Utah State Railroad Museum in Ogden. Both are static displays, stripped of major components. Out of 55 of the most powerful locomotives ever built in America, only 2 incomplete shells remain. The Union Pacific gas turbines represented the peak of American locomotive ambition. They were among the biggest and most powerful freight locomotives ever built. They could haul trains single-handedly that normally required multiple diesels, and they dominated the remote plains where noise did not matter. But they were too loud for cities, too hot for infrastructure, too expensive once fuel economics changed, and too specialized for a railroad that needed flexibility. In the end, these machines were defeated by their own excess. The jet engines that gave them incredible power also made them impossible to live with. The big blows proved that in railroading, there is such a thing as too much power and too much noise. A passenger train rolls into a major terminal like Penn Station, slows down through the tunnel, and comes to a complete stop at the platform with the brakes hissing and the doors sliding open. People step off, people step on, conductors check their watches, and the whole time that locomotive just sits there screaming at full throttle like it is trying to climb a mountain. Around 900 RPM, a turbocharged 16-cylinder diesel howling at what sounds like maximum effort, and the train is not even moving. The platform vibrates under your feet. Conversations become difficult, and if you are standing too close, you can feel that sound in your chest. The engine does not throttle down, because with its electrical system online, it largely cannot, and everyone on that platform is left wondering why nobody turned this thing off. This is the EMDF 40PH, the locomotive that seemed unable to quiet down even when standing still. With head-end power engaged, the electrical system effectively required the engine to stay at a constant high RPM, and there was very little the engineer could do about it. Standing, moving, coasting, boarding passengers. In normal service, the engine speed stayed largely the same. High RPM, hour after hour, for decades. Crews called it the Screamer. The story starts in 1975, when Amtrak had a serious problem on its hands. Their new flagship locomotive, the SDP-40F, became associated with derailments and mechanical issues across the network, and several host railroads imposed restrictions or outright bans on the type. Amtrak needed a replacement, and they needed it fast. EMD's answer was the F40PH. They took a proven freight locomotive, the GP42, wrapped it in a streamlined cowl body, and added something called head-end power, spelled HEP. Head-end power provides electricity to the passenger cars for lights, heat, air conditioning, everything passengers expect. Previous locomotives relied on steam generators for heating, heavy, complex, and increasingly outdated. Head-end power was the future. Clean electrical power delivered straight from the locomotive. The problem was physics. American electrical systems run at 60 Hz, and to generate that frequency, the alternator has to spin at approximately 893 revolutions per minute. Because the F40PH's head-end power alternator was mechanically tied to the main engine, the engine itself had to run at about the same speed, effectively full throttle whenever head-end power was supplying power. The throttle in the cab only controlled how much power went to the traction motors. Engine speed? With head-end power online, it changed very little. You could be crawling through a station at 5 miles per hour, and the prime mover would still be roaring like you were running flat out on the Northeast Corridor. Crews figured this out quickly. If you had 2 locomotives on a train, you put head-end power on the trailing unit so the lead engineer got something resembling peace and quiet, while the second unit carried the noise. But on single-unit trains, no such luck. You sat in that cab with a turbocharged diesel screaming behind your head for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours at a stretch. No real break. No relief. Just that constant howl wearing you down until you tied up at the end of the run and the ringing in your ears slowly faded. The cabs weren't well insulated either. Railroad.net forums are full of engineers describing what it was like. Earplugs helped to a point, but the vibration came through the seat, the floor, the walls. One former Amtrak engineer summed it up simply: you could feel it in your chest. And it wasn't just the crews. Stand on almost any platform where an F40PH was idling with head-end power online and you heard it, that constant turbocharged howl, the station itself vibrating around you. The locomotive would coast in, slow down, come to a stop, and the sound never dropped. Passengers learned to step back, not because the train was dangerous, but because standing next to it could be physically uncomfortable. Rapido Trains, in their technical documentation, described it perfectly, saying it was quite unique to see an F40PH coast into a station and come to a stop, all while roaring at full bore. They were not exaggerating. To many people, it really did sound like the locomotive was about to launch itself through the station wall. Between 1976 and 1992, EMD built roughly 450 F40PH locomotives. Amtrak took more than 200 of them. Metra in Chicago ordered a large fleet, and other agencies followed, including MBTA, New Jersey Transit, Caltrain, and VA Rail Canada. The F40PH became the face of American passenger railroading for nearly 2 decades, hauling trains like the California Zephyr across the Rockies, the Empire Builder through Montana, and the Coast Starlight along the Pacific Coast. And at every station stop, it screamed. The irony is that the F40PH was a good locomotive in most respects, reliable, capable, and mechanically simpler than what it replaced. Many engineers liked how it handled. The acceleration, the braking, the responsiveness. What they did not like was spending entire shifts inside a noise that never stopped. By the late 1980s, railroads began looking for solutions. The fix was straightforward. Separate the head-end power generator from the main engine, add a small auxiliary diesel for electrical power, and let the prime mover behave like a normal locomotive again. Boston's MBTA was among the first to do this, rebuilding units into the F40PH2C configuration with an extended car body and a separate generator. When these locomotives idled, they actually idled, and the contrast with the original screamers was immediate. New Jersey Transit pursued similar rebuilds using Caterpillar generators, and Via Rail later rebuilt its fleet with separate head-end power systems. One by one, the original shaft-driven head-end power locomotives disappeared from everyday service. Amtrak retired its F40PH fleet by 2001, replacing them with the quieter GE Genesis locomotives. A couple dozen units were converted into non-powered cab cars, called cabbages by railfans, and they still run today as silent control units for push-pull trains. Some original screamers survived into the 2020s. Metra in Chicago kept the largest remaining fleet, while others found second lives on tourist and industrial railways, including the Grand Canyon Railway and the Panama Canal Railway. But the sound is fading. As newer equipment replaces them, the constant high RPM howl is becoming a memory. Many remaining units are now effectively preservation pieces, running on borrowed time. There is a comment on YouTube from a former engineer who ran F40PHs for both Amtrak and New Jersey Transit. He described standing on a platform as a kid, watching the train arrive, the station shaking, the lights flickering on in the coaches, the engine screaming. Years later, he became an engineer and spent decades in that cab. His last line was simple: "I miss them." That is the thing about the F40PH. Nothing failed. That sound was simply the price everyone paid for keeping the lights on. 60 Hz required a fixed engine speed, and physics does not compromise. When railroads fixed the problem with separate generators, variable engine speed, and quiet idle, they fixed the sound too. Progress, efficiency, comfort, all the things you are supposed to want. And in the process, something disappeared from American railroads that will not come back. A locomotive that announced itself before you ever saw it. A sound that meant the train had arrived whether you were ready or not. The F40PH did not fade quietly. It just kept screaming until someone finally turned it off. In 1961, British Rail took engines designed for torpedo boats, bolted 2 of them into a passenger locomotive, and sent it straight onto Britain's busiest main line. Decades later, crew accounts still describe ear protection as standard kit for anyone who had to step into the engine room. Nothing about this was accidental. The engine did exactly what it had been built to do, just not in a setting that suited it. The Napier Deltic engine was designed in the late 1940s to deliver extreme power from the smallest possible package. It was built to run at high RPM for short periods and then be shut down, not to sit inside an enclosed steel box pulling passenger trains for hours at a time. Noise, vibration, and crew comfort were secondary considerations because in its original role, the engine lived in open hulls. The crew wore headsets, and nobody was standing next to it for 6 hours straight. 18 cylinders were arranged in 3 banks forming a triangle, with a crankshaft at each corner, all connected by phasing gears to a single output shaft. It was a 2-stroke design with opposed pistons, which meant no cylinder heads and no valves, just ports in the cylinder walls that opened and closed as the pistons moved past them. The result was described in engineering accounts as producing combustion events at roughly every 20 degrees of crankshaft rotation, which created the distinctive buzzing exhaust note that would later echo through British railway stations for 2 decades. English Electric, who owned Napier at the time, saw an opportunity that nobody else was chasing. In 1955, They built a prototype locomotive at their Preston works with 2 of these marine engines installed, producing a combined 3,300 horsepower, placing it among the most powerful single-unit diesel locomotives of its era. The styling looked like nothing British Railways had seen before. A bulldog nose inspired by American designs, high sides with cream striping to make the bulk look more slender, and a presence that announced this was not just another diesel, but something genuinely new. The prototype spent several years in service and trials on British metals, covering 450,000 miles across a wide range of mainline duties and test work. The London Midland region's chief mechanical engineer reportedly rejected the concept, believing that high-speed engines running at 1,500 revolutions per minute were fundamentally unsuitable for railway applications, and he wanted nothing to do with them. But Gerard Fines at the Eastern region is widely credited in later accounts with seeing exactly what the Deltic could do for his problem, which was that the existing diesels could not match what the Gressley Pacifics had been doing on the East Coast Main Line, and he pushed British Rail's management until they approved an order for 22 production locomotives to replace 55 steam engines. There was just one issue that everyone involved had seen coming, but could not fully solve. English Electric knew that putting 2 naval combat engines inside an enclosed locomotive body was going to create noise problems, so they incorporated soundproofing between the body sides and cab walls from the start. They understood that running at 1,500 revolutions per minute was far beyond what conventional railway diesels produced, and they understood that the 2-stroke firing pattern created acoustic characteristics unlike anything crews had experienced before. The production Deltics arrived with soundproofing already built in. British Rail measured what the crews were actually experiencing, and secondary sources summarizing earlier material state that British Rail considered the cab noise levels unacceptable. That finding led to several additional modifications that eventually brought the range down to 83 to 102 decibels with all doors and windows closed. No publicly available source specifies what the levels were before those modifications, and no source clarifies whether the 19 decibel spread represents the difference between idle and full power, or variation between individual locomotives, or different measurement positions within the cab. Those details appear to survive only in Brian Webb's 1982 book on the class, which has never been digitized. What we do know is that the post-modification numbers still exceeded what modern occupational health standards consider safe for extended exposure. By current standards, the threshold for mandatory hearing conservation programs is 85 decibels over an 8-hour shift, and Deltic crews were running London to Edinburgh routes that could take around 6 hours, often at levels that pushed well beyond that limit during high-power operation. First-hand accounts fill in what the official measurements leave vague. Former crew members who worked the class described the engine room as a place you simply did not linger unless you wanted to damage your hearing. Multiple crew recollections describe earplugs being used specifically for engine room access, particularly when the steam heating boiler located between the 2 engines needed attention, a task that was eliminated only after electric train heating conversions began in the early 1970s. A 2019 cab ride report on a preserved Deltic noted that the noise remained noticeable and must have been wearying for regular drivers on long runs, even after all the additional soundproofing that had been installed decades earlier. At the major stations along the East Coast Main Line, King's Cross, York, Newcastle Central, and Edinburgh Waverley, first-hand accounts describe an idling Deltic drowning out the public address system, and a departing one remaining audible for minutes after it had left the platform. The sound reverberating through those Victorian train sheds in a way that no other diesel could match. But the underlying engineering reality kept asserting itself in ways that went well beyond noise. The Deltic engine was what engineers described as highly strung, a term used to describe machinery that demanded precision handling and specialist overhaul rather than routine in situ repair. Accounts describe British Rail maintaining a substantial pool of spare engines at Doncaster to keep 22 locomotives available, and the rapid swap policy that made this work depended on specialist knowledge that English Electric had spent years developing. When British Rail took over engine maintenance themselves in 1970, contemporary accounts suggest it went wrong almost immediately. Within a year or so of the changeover, sources describe half the fleet being grounded at the same time. Fractured cylinder liners, which had always been an occasional problem, escalated alarmingly. The workshops at Doncaster had been designed for conventional railway equipment, and the Deltic engines demanded naval-grade precision that took years to fully master. Exhaust fires became a well-documented Deltic problem during the service years, often attributed in reports and later analysis to oil accumulating in the exhaust system and igniting during sustained high-power running. The original bogies cracked under the punishment of daily 100 miles per hour operation and had to be replaced with stronger cast designs. By the mid-1970s, the bodywork itself was developing cracks and showing rust, raising questions about how much longer these machines could continue. They were too loud, too complex, too demanding of specialist maintenance, and too expensive to keep running compared to what replaced them. On the East Coast Main Line, however, they filled a performance gap that was not fully closed until high-speed train services arrived in 1978. The earplugs stayed in the equipment lockers until the very end, and the crews kept wearing them whenever the engine room demanded attention.